Have you ever noticed how the loudest message you send is often in the moment you say nothing at all? It's not always what you say that defines you, it's what you choose not to say. When you stay silent instead of chasing, when you don't explain yourself after being mistreated, when you walk away without drama, that silence speaks volumes. It reveals your standards, it sets boundaries, it shows emotional maturity, and most importantly, it makes people wonder. In a world addicted to instant responses and constant validation, being the one who holds back, who lets curiosity build, is magnetic. Your silence can spark intrigue. Your calm can demand respect. Your mystery, that's what pulls people in. Not because you're hiding, but because you're selective. And that selection makes you valuable. The right kind of silence it doesn't say, I don't care. It says, I know what I'm worth. So if you've ever felt the urge to prove yourself through words, what if the real power is in what you don't say? Because when you say nothing, it truly says everything. Let's talk about how to use that silence, not as a wall, but as a statement, one they'll never forget. When you choose not to chase, when you choose not to over-explain, when you choose not to fight for someone's attention, you're not being cold and you're not playing games. You're actually saying something far more profound than any words could convey. You're revealing your standards. You see, people think silence is weakness. They think if they don't say something, they're being walked over. But there's a certain kind of silence that is incredibly powerful. It's the silence of someone who knows what they bring to the table, someone who doesn't feel the need to overcompensate, someone who knows that presence doesn't always need to be loud to be felt. And in relationships, especially early on, we get tricked into thinking we need to constantly explain our feelings, our reactions, our boundaries. We feel like we owe people answers, that we need to justify why we're pulling away or why we didn't reply immediately or why we're not okay with certain behavior. But when you've done the internal work, when you've built real self-worth, you begin to realize that not everything needs to be explained. Sometimes the most confident response is no response at all. Let's say someone you're dating starts pulling away. They stop making an effort. They get distant. What most people do in that situation is panic. They rush in with messages, trying to reestablish the connection, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to get back to how it used to be. They think, if I just say the right thing, maybe I can fix this. But every time you do that, you send a message. You're saying, your inconsistent behavior is enough to shake me. I'll lower my standard for a moment of connection. But when you choose not to chase, when you let their silence speak for itself, and you don't try to fill the gap with your own words, you say something much stronger. You say, I noticed the change. I felt the shift, and I'm not going to chase someone who doesn't value me. That silence becomes your standard. It becomes your boundary. It's not bitterness. It's not coldness. It's clarity. There's a calmness that comes from knowing what you deserve. And when you operate from that place, you don't need to broadcast it to everyone. You show it through how you behave, through what you tolerate, and more importantly, through what you don't tolerate. When someone disrespects your time, when they don't follow through on what they say, when they show you they're not serious, you don't need a speech. You don't need a dramatic exit. You don't need to get your closure. Sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is simply stop showing up for someone who doesn't show up for you. Think about it. If you're at a dinner party and someone's constantly interrupting you, talking over you, making you feel small, you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to fight for space. You can just choose to leave quietly with your head high. That silence will echo louder than any argument. The same principle applies in dating and relationships. There are moments where speaking up is important. Don't get me wrong, communication is essential, but not everything deserves a response. Not every behavior needs a breakdown. Not everyone earns the right to hear your inner thoughts. Sometimes the message is in your absence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to not say anything and walk away. And it's not easy, especially when you care, especially when you're used to giving, especially when your instinct is to fix or please. But growth is learning that silence can be strength, that self-respect sometimes looks like not replying, that confidence isn't always loud. It's in knowing that you don't have to explain your worth to anyone. And when you carry yourself like that, when your silence says, I won't lower my standard for temporary affection, you don't just protect your heart, you attract people who actually value it. People who recognize your calm for what it is, certainty. People who feel the weight of your silence and want to fill it, not because they're scared of losing you, but because they genuinely see your value. It's funny, we think the loudest people are the most confident, but some of the most attractive, magnetic people I've ever met, they don't always have the loudest voices. They have the strongest boundaries. They know what they will and won't accept. And that's not something they shout from the rooftops. It's something you feel when you're in their presence. So remember this, when someone treats you like an option, when they go hot and cold, when they stop showing up in the way you deserve, don't try to prove your worth. Don't chase validation. Don't beg for clarity. Let your silence speak. Because when you say nothing, it says everything. You ever notice how when someone pulls back just a little, you start thinking about them more? They're not gone, they're not ghosting you, but there's this tiny space that suddenly exists. And in that space, something happens. You become curious. You start wondering, what are they doing? What are they thinking? And whether you like it or not, your attention shifts toward them. Now, I'm not talking about playing games or intentionally withdrawing just to manipulate someone's interest. That's not authentic, and people can feel it. What I'm talking about is understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of something deeper. It creates room, and in that room, desire can grow. Here's the mistake so many people make in dating. We feel like we need to fill every gap, every unanswered message, every quiet moment, every slight delay. We rush in to fill it with words, explanations, over-texting, chasing. It's like we're trying to prove that we're worth staying for by always being available. But the truth is, when you make yourself too available, when you're always quick to respond, always ready with the next line, the other person doesn't get the chance to miss you. They don't get the chance to wonder. Think about the early stages of a connection. The magic lives in the questions, not the answers. It's the wondering that builds attraction. It's that small uncertainty, that what if, that creates emotional tension. And when we constantly jump in to fill that tension, we're actually killing the very thing we're hoping to build. There's a difference between being open and being overexposed. When you leave a little room, when you don't always respond instantly, when you don't explain yourself every time something feels off, you create a moment of pause. And in that pause, they start leaning in. But here's the key. It has to come from a place of confidence. Because if you're silent, but anxiously silent, they can feel that too. If you're not responding, but you're checking your phone every 2 minutes, wondering if they've noticed, that's not powerful silence. That's fearful silence. And that's not attractive. True power is in the silence that comes from self-trust, from knowing if I give this space and they walk away, then they were never really here, for me anyway. That's when silence becomes magnetic. You're not pulling back to test them. You're not being distant to play a role. You're simply giving the connection enough space to reveal its truth. If they lean in, great. If they don't, that tells you something even more important. Sometimes we feel like if we're quiet, we'll be forgotten. But the people who forget you when you go silent were never paying real attention in the first place. The people who are truly intrigued by you, the ones who feel something real, they notice the silence. They feel the shift, and it creates a reaction. Think of it like music. The pauses between notes are just as important as the notes themselves. Without those silences, the rhythm is off. It becomes noise instead of melody. Relationships work the same way. If you're always playing, always talking, always filling in, there's no rhythm, no anticipation, no moment for someone to lean in and hear the music beneath your words. I've seen so many people sabotage great connections because they couldn't handle the silence. They mistook space for disinterest. They mistook calm for cold, and so they rushed to fix something that wasn't broken, only to create pressure where there should have been peace. We all want clarity. We all want answers. But sometimes the answer is in the quiet. And if you can learn to sit in that quiet without panicking, without trying to make something happen, you give yourself an edge most people don't have. You start operating from a place of strength rather than insecurity. You become the kind of person who doesn't just react to silence, but uses it. You let it work for you because you understand that in the right context, saying nothing says everything, and the right person will hear it. You know, one of the most underrated signs of emotional maturity is knowing when not to speak. We live in a world where reacting quickly has become a default setting. Someone says something that stings and our instinct is to fire back. Someone ghosts us and we're already typing that follow-up message, asking what happened, why they disappeared, whether we did something wrong. It's like we're constantly trying to control the narrative, to defend ourselves, to explain. But here's the truth that most people miss. The most powerful response is often no response at all. There's a deep strength in the silence you choose, not the silence that comes from being unsure or afraid, but the silence that's rooted in clarity. When you're emotionally mature, you begin to realize that not every situation deserves your energy. You begin to understand that your peace is more valuable than being right, that your self-respect is more important than winning the argument. It's not about avoiding difficult conversations. It's not about ghosting or shutting down. It's about discernment, the ability to pause, breathe, and decide. Is this a moment where silence says more? Think about it. When someone disrespects you, you could call them out, argue, plead for an apology, or you could simply withdraw. You could remove yourself from that energy. That silence, it says, I'm not going to fight for what doesn't value me. It says, this is not the level I operate on. That isn't weakness. That's strength in its purest form. Because silence doesn't always mean nothing is happening. Sometimes silence is where self-respect lives. It's the space where you hold your boundaries without having to scream them. It's the message you send that says, I don't chase chaos. I don't beg to be chosen. I don't explain myself to someone who doesn't want to understand. And yes, I get it. Silence can feel uncomfortable, especially when you're used to trying to fix things, smooth things over, or when you're someone who wants to be understood. But let me tell you something. When you reach a certain level of emotional growth, you stop performing for people who don't care to listen. You stop breaking your own peace just to make someone else comfortable. Some of the most powerful moments in dating and relationships come from that non-reaction. When someone pulls away and you don't chase. When someone disrespects you and you don't argue, you step back. When someone gives you mixed signals and you don't try to decode them, you just let them go. That silence, that's self-worth in action. Because the person who needs to be chased, cajoled, or convinced to treat you right is not your person. And the moment you realize that, your silence stops being about them. It becomes about you, about your healing, your standards, your future. You also start to see something else. Silence creates space. And in that space, people reveal themselves. You give them the room to either step up or step out. You're no longer holding the relationship together with constant communication or emotional labor. You're watching. You're listening. You're observing who meets you where you are. And if they don't, you don't fill the silence to compensate. You let it speak. There's a difference between being silent to punish someone and being silent to protect your energy. One is manipulation. The other is maturity. And you know the difference. You feel it in your gut. One comes from insecurity. The other comes from confidence. Someone once told me, if they care, they'll notice your silence. And if they don't, your words wouldn't have mattered anyway. That hit me. Because we spend so much time trying to get closure from people who are never capable of giving it. We craft the perfect message, try to explain our perspective, hoping that this time they'll finally get it. But they don't. Not because you didn't explain it well enough, but because they were never listening in the first place. And so silence becomes your boundary, not a wall, but a filter. A way to sift out the ones who were only there when it was easy or when you were doing all the work. The ones who disappear when you stop feeding the connection. That's when the truth reveals itself. When you say nothing, it says everything. You don't need to announce your worth. It's in how you carry yourself. That's something we forget in the heat of wanting to be understood, validated, or seen by someone. We try to explain ourselves, to prove that we're good enough, to convince someone of our value with words. But here's the truth. People rarely hear you through your words when they're not ready to see you through your actions. You ever notice how someone can give you a compliment, tell you how amazing you are, and yet their behavior makes you question everything? The texts slow down, the tone gets colder, the effort drops off. In those moments, they might still say all the right things, but your gut knows better. That's because actions speak while words rest. And the same applies in reverse. You can say nothing and still say everything. Walking away from a situation that doesn't serve you says more than 1,000 explanations about your self-worth. Not responding to a message that disrespects your time or energy says you're not available for that kind of treatment. Choosing silence over drama says you value peace over pointless noise. There is immense strength in restraint, in knowing that just because someone doesn't see your value right now, doesn't mean you need to jump into a sales pitch to remind them of it. Your value doesn't decrease just because someone else isn't smart enough to recognize it. In fact, when you feel the urge to over-explain, to win someone back with words, to show them what they're missing, that's the exact moment to step back. Because what you're really trying to do is protect your ego. You're trying to avoid that sting of feeling rejected, misunderstood, or unseen. But here's the real test of confidence. Can you let someone misread you, misunderstand you, and still stay grounded in the truth of who you are? Because real confidence doesn't rush to prove itself. It doesn't panic in silence. It knows that the person who's meant to understand will do so, not because you screamed your worth into the void, but because you showed it in how you live, how you treat yourself, and what you tolerate. I see so many people chase closure with words. They write long texts explaining how they feel, detailing what went wrong, hoping that if they just say it the right way, the other person will finally get it. But often, the other person isn't listening. Not really. They're not in a place to meet you where you are. And in trying to get them to see you, you abandon yourself. But when you act in alignment with your value, when you show that you don't stick around where you're not respected, you send a far stronger message than anything you could say in a paragraph or a phone call. Think about it like this. Silence is a boundary. It's a way of saying you no longer get access to my energy just because you ask for it. And that silence, that decision to step back, to not fill the space with justifications or neediness, that's where power lives. That's where dignity lives. It's not cold. It's not cruel. It's clarity. It's clarity that says, I won't invest where I'm not valued. And yes, it might confuse the other person at first. They might expect you to chase, to explain, to stay available because that's what they're used to. But when you do the opposite, when you just keep living, keep moving, keep glowing without needing their attention to fuel you, you show them something different. You show them you're not waiting around to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. And that's where it all shifts. Because suddenly you're not operating from a place of needing someone to see you. You're operating from a place of knowing you're already enough. And when you start living from that place, people notice. The right people lean in, the wrong ones fall away. And all of it happens not because you shouted louder or argued better, but because you quietly embodied your standards. So when you feel tempted to explain yourself just one more time, to say something that might finally change their mind, pause. Ask yourself, do I want to be heard or do I want to be honored? Because if it's the latter, you don't have to say anything. Just act in a way that reflects your worth. When you do that, silence becomes a statement. And your actions, your presence, your choices, they speak volumes. And they always will. There's something incredibly powerful about the silence that follows disrespect. When someone crosses a line, pushes a boundary, or shows you who they really are, your instinct might be to react, to defend, to argue, to try and explain why what they did wasn't okay, hoping they'll understand, or worse, change. But the truth is, silence often says what words can't. When you stop engaging, when you pull your energy back, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, you communicate something far more compelling than any monologue ever could. You're saying, that's not how I allow myself to be treated. And here's what's key. It's not a punishment, it's a standard. It's you recognizing that not every action deserves a response. And not every person deserves continued access to you. Silence isn't cold, it's clarity. It's a firm, quiet boundary that tells the world how you expect to be treated, not by shouting it, but by living it. Most people are so afraid of silence because they think it means weakness. They think if they don't react, they're being walked over. But the opposite is true. It takes strength to be silent. It takes discipline not to fire back, to resist the urge to prove a point or to seek validation from someone who just disrespected you. Silence is restraint, and restraint is magnetic, because here's what happens when you go quiet after someone treats you poorly. They notice. They feel the shift. Whether they acknowledge it or not, they realize they no longer have the same access to your time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth. That absence, that quiet removal of your presence, it speaks volumes. It says you don't need to convince anyone of your worth. You don't need to fight to be understood by someone who doesn't value you. And you certainly don't need to stick around and explain what they should have known already, how to treat you with basic decency. And this goes beyond romantic relationships. It applies to friends, family, colleagues, anyone who continually steps past your boundaries. You don't owe anyone a loud exit. You owe yourself peace. And sometimes the only way to protect that peace is by saying less and doing more. Specifically, doing less in their direction. It's not about being passive aggressive. It's not about ghosting people as a way to avoid hard conversations. It's about recognizing the difference between silence that punishes and silence that protects. The first is rooted in control. The second is rooted in power. People often